Hello everyone and welcome to our brand new series on Spring Boot interview questions. If you are new here, we have already covered Java interview questions on fundamentals, object-oriented programming, string class and exception handling in the core Java interview questions playlist. Link for the same is available in the description. Today we are kicking off our Spring Boot interview prep with the most important fundamental questions and their interview specific answers. Let's get started. So the most basic question is, what is Spring Boot? So Spring Boot is a Spring module which provides rapid application development features to the Spring framework. It is used to create a standalone Spring based application that we can just run because it needs very little Spring configuration. Another important questions from interview perspective is, explain difference between Spring and Spring Boot. So let us understand them with the help of features. So, purpose: Spring Framework provides comprehensive infrastructure for building enterprise Java applications. On the other hand, Spring Boot simplifies Spring application development with auto configuration and starter dependencies. With respect to configuration, Spring Framework requires extensive manual setup by XML or Java based configuration. On the other hand, Spring Boot requires minimal configuration using annotations and properties files. Dependency management in Spring Framework is manual, and in Spring Boot it is built in with the help of starter dependencies. We need an external server for configuration and deployment in Spring Framework, but in Spring Boot we get embedded servers such as Tomcat, Jetty, Undertow, etc. Deployment: typically Spring Framework is deployed as a war file, and on the other hand, Spring Boot can be deployed as a standalone jar or war, and it runs with a single command. The development of speed of development is slower because of the manual setup in Spring Framework, but it is faster due to sensible defaults and less boilerplate. So the key features in Spring Framework is dependency injection, inversion of control, etc. And the key features in Spring Boot is auto configuration, embedded servers, opinionated defaults, etc. So how does a Spring Boot application work? So Spring Boot automatically configures your application on the basis of dependencies which we have added to the project in the POM by using annotations. The entry point of the Spring Boot application is the class that contains @Spring Boot application annotation and the main method. So what is the starting point of a Spring Boot application? So the starting point of a Spring Boot application is the class annotated with @Spring Boot application annotation, as we saw above, and it also contains a public static void main method. This method, called spring application.run, which bootstraps the application, starts the Spring context, and if needed launches the embedded server. So another important question is, where do we define the properties in the Spring Boot application? So we can define both application and Spring Boot related properties into a file called application.properties. We can create this file manually or by using Spring Initializer to create this file. We do not need to do any special configuration to instruct Spring Boot to load this file. If it exists in the class path, then Spring Boot automatically loads it and configures itself and the application code accordingly. So what are starter dependencies? So Spring Boot starter is a Maven template that contains a collection of all the relevant transitive dependencies that are needed to start a particular functionality. For example, we need to import Spring Boot starter web dependency for creating a web application. So here it is an example of it. We have a dependency tag. Inside it we are having group ID, which is org spring framework.boot. Artifact ID is Spring Boot starter web. We can also have other tags such as version as well as exclusions. So if we want to exclude any dependencies which are being used by our dependency. So what is Spring Initializer? So it is a web-based application that helps us to create an initial Spring Boot project structure and provides a Maven or Gradle file to build their code. It solves the problem of setting up framework when you are starting a project from scratch. So another important question from interview perspective is, what is the default port of Tomcat in Spring Boot? How we can change the same? So the default port is of Tomcat server is 8080, which is 8080. It can be changed by adding server.port properties in the application.property file, and we can keep any port like 8081. So how to replace embedded Tomcat as a default server? So if we add the Spring Boot starter web dependency, then it by default provides us with an embedded Tomcat server. We can swap out the Tomcat for another server like Jetty by adding the relevant starter dependency such as Spring Boot starter Jetty in the POM file. So can we disable the default embedded server? If yes, then how? So yes, the answer is yes, we can disable the default embedded server, and we can do the same by using spring.main.web-application-type equal to none in the application.properties file. So this is another important question from the interviewer perspective. What is the version of Spring Framework, Spring Boot, and embedded Tomcat in your application? So it's always a good practice to know the version of core dependencies. This includes the Spring Framework, Spring Boot, embedded Tomcat, and any other important libraries. So staying aware of these versions help avoid compatibility issues. Also, it gives a good impression on the interviewer as they get a sense of your day-to-day involvement with the development project. Another important question is how to enable debugging logs in the Spring Boot. So we can enable debugging logs in three ways. First is we can either start the application with hyphen hyphen debug switch, or we can set the logging.level.root equal to debug in the application.property file, or we can set the logging level of the root logger to debug in the supplied logging configuration file if we are using anything like log4j2 etc. So this is another important question. Provide steps to create a CRUD application using Spring Boot. So first we have to create the project structure either manually or by using Spring Initializer. Second is we have to create a POJO, plain old Java object class. Third is we have to create a controller class and we have to declare the method. This class will be annotated with @controller or @rest controller annotation. Then we have to create a service class which is annotated by @service annotation for business logic. Then we have to create a repository class which extends the CRUD repository or JPA repository. It will be called by the service class. Then in the application.properties file, we can specify the database properties such as driver name, dialect, username, password in the application.properties file. So what is the difference between repository annotated class extending JPA repository or CRUD repository? So both provide more or less the same methods, but JPA repository also extends paging and sorting repository. So it provides all the methods for which are useful for implementing pagination, while CRUD repository doesn't provide the methods for implementing pagination and sorting. This is one of the important question. Explain the concept of Spring Boot's lazy initialization. So lazy initialization defers bean creation until they are first requested. So instead of creating the beans at the startup, it is deferring bean creation until they are first requested. So it potentially reduces the startup time. We can enable it globally with the spring.main.lazy-initialization equal to true in the application properties file, or we can use @lazy annotation on specific classes to load it lazily. So that's it for today's video on fundamental Spring Boot interview questions. If you find this helpful, don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. Stay tuned. Our next videos will cover Spring Boot, annotations, advanced topics like exception handling, asynchronous processing and much more. Thanks for watching and I will see you in the next one.